Why did one hardened cowboy stop at the lonely widow's table when an entire Wyoming town had spent the morning walking past her? The courthouse fell silent as Margaret gripped the edge of the table, Whitmore watching from across the room. A lawyer's notebook snapped shut. Boots scraped behind her. Then came the sound she never expected, 12 cowboys filing into the hall. But the man she searched for hadn't moved. What was Caleb Reed waiting to say? Stay with the story and tell me where you're watching from. Margaret Dawson did not cry when another family walked past her table. She had learned somewhere between burying her husband and closing the door of her bakery for the last time that tears in public only gave people something else to carry home and discuss over supper. So she stood straight. The Frontier Harvest Market outside Red Creek was already alive around her. Wagon wheels bumped over the hard Wyoming ground. Horses stamped at hitch rails. Children darted between livestock pens while merchants called out prices for apples, leather goods, preserves, and fresh eggs. Coins struck wooden counters up and down the row. At Margaret's table, there was mostly silence. She reached out and straightened her handwritten sign. Dawson's Baked Goods. It was already straight. She had been awake since 3 that morning. 6 honey wheat loaves had gone into the oven before daylight. Then cinnamon rolls glazed with brown sugar and real vanilla, 4 peach pies, and a pan of cornbread she had nearly left at home. By 7:30, she had everything arranged beneath a faded canvas awning at the worst end of the market row. By 10, she had sold 1 loaf. 30 cents rested in the small tin beside her hand. Nearly $2 had gone into flour, butter, sugar, fruit, yeast, and lamp oil. Margaret stopped doing the arithmetic. 2 women in good dresses slowed several yards away. Is that the Dawson widow? I believe so. Didn't she have that bakery on 4th Street? For a while. A pause. Then, softly enough to pretend kindness and loudly enough to be heard. Bless her heart. Margaret moved 1 cinnamon roll half an inch to the left. She hated those 3 words. Thomas had never spoken to her that way. 3 years and 4 months earlier, before fever took him, he had stood in their little kitchen while she kneaded bread and stolen a bit of dough from her fingers. You know what you do? He'd said. Margaret had swatted his hand away. Make bread, apparently. Thomas had smiled. You make a room feel like home. She had remembered that when she opened the bakery after his death. She had remembered it during the first inspection, and the second, and the third. Complaints about storage, complaints about cleanliness, questions about permits that had never been questions before customers started choosing her shop over other places in town. Nothing serious was ever proven. It did not have to be. People saw an inspector at the door often enough, and eventually they stopped coming through it. Margaret sold the ovens to pay what she owed. Now she stood behind a market table, wondering if she had been foolish enough to try again. She was considering packing early when she heard boots approaching. Not fast, not heavy, measured. She looked up. The man moving down the row was tall, broad through the shoulders, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His coat had dust along the lower seam. His boots looked repaired rather than fashionable. He carried himself like a man accustomed to open country and long days in a saddle. People made room for him without being asked. Margaret expected him to pass. He slowed, then stopped. His eyes went first to the food, not to her dress, not to her figure, not to her face with the quick little calculation she had learned to recognize. The food. He picked up a cinnamon roll and turned it once in his hand. How much? 2 cents. He laid down the coins. Then he took a bite. Right there. Margaret waited. His jaw moved slowly. He looked down at the roll again. What's in the glaze? Brown sugar, butter, vanilla from the bottle, a little salt. Real vanilla? Yes. He took another bite. For the first time that morning, Margaret forgot about the people walking past. The man looked at her. This is the best thing I've tasted in 10 years. She almost smiled, but the habit of caution caught it halfway. Thank you. You make all this? I do. His gaze moved across the loaves, pies, cornbread, and rolls, then back to her. I'll take it. Margaret blinked. The cinnamon rolls? All of it. She stared at him. Sir, that's nearly $4 worth. I heard you. He counted out $4.50 and placed the money beside her tin. Around them, the market seemed to tilt. The same people who had spent all morning finding reasons not to look at Margaret Dawson suddenly had nowhere else to look. The man began gathering bread. Margaret came around the table to help. She did not glance toward the women who had said, "Bless her heart. Let them watch." At a large wagon near the edge of the grounds, marked Reed Ranch, the man set down the last peach pie with surprising care. Caleb Reed, he said. Margaret Dawson. His eyes held hers. Mrs. Dawson. It was not a question. She nodded. Caleb rested one hand on the wagon rail. I've got 12 men 8 miles north of here, and a cook who quit 6 weeks ago. Since then, one of my cowhands has been trying to feed us. Trying? That's the charitable description. A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Caleb noticed. He did not make anything of it. I need someone who knows what she's doing, he continued. You'd have the kitchen, your own room in the house. Wages agreed before you start. I won't ask you to do anything except the work you're hired for. Margaret's smile disappeared. She studied him carefully. Law, you understand what Red Creek will say about a widow going to live on a ranch with 12 cowboys. Caleb glanced toward the market, where several people were pretending not to stare. Seems to me they're already talking. Margaret said nothing. He looked back at her. Might as well let them talk about you earning honest money. She almost laughed again. Almost. I won't answer today. I didn't ask you to. The market comes back in 2 weeks. I know. I'll give you my answer then. Caleb put on his hat. I'll be here. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen with the $4.50 spread across the table. She counted it once, then again. Beside the coins lay Thomas's old pocket knife, the handle worn smooth where his thumb had rested for years. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret looked toward the cold oven. She had spent 3 years learning how not to want things she could lose. That was what frightened her now. Not Caleb Reed, not 12 cowboys, not Red Creek gossip. She wanted to say yes. 2 weeks later, Caleb was waiting beside his wagon when Margaret crossed the market grounds toward him. He took off his hat. She stopped in front of him. When do you need me? Caleb Reed looked at her for one quiet second, as if making sure she meant it. Tomorrow morning. Margaret nodded. By sunrise the next day, her wagon was rolling north out of Red Creek. The road climbed gently through open Wyoming country, past dry grass silvered with morning light and long fence lines running toward the foothills. Cottonwoods followed a narrow creek below the road. Farther off, cattle moved in dark clusters beneath a sky so wide it made every building look temporary. Reed Ranch appeared after 8 miles. A broad main house stood above the corrals, with a bunkhouse farther west and smoke lifting from its chimney. Saddles hung from a rail outside the barn. Men were already moving cattle through a gate when Margaret pulled into the yard. Caleb was waiting. Mrs. Dawson. Mr. Reed. He took the heaviest crate from the wagon. That was all the welcome either of them seemed to need. The kitchen was worse than Margaret expected. She stood in the doorway and took in the blackened skillet, bacon grease on the stove, coffee boiled nearly to tar, and a pantry where flour, beans, salt, and canned peaches had been stacked, according to no system known to God or man. Caleb watched her face. Margaret rolled up her sleeves. I'll need to see the pantry. Something near relief moved through his expression. Yes, ma'am. By 6:30, she had oatmeal on the stove, bacon in the pan, biscuits in the oven, and the coffee made strong without tasting burned. The first cowboy through the door was a compact young man with suspicious eyes. He looked at Margaret, then the oatmeal. "You the new cook?" "I am." "What happened to Pete's oatmeal?" "I didn't burn it." The cowboy stared at her, then sat down. His name, she learned, was Dell. He took one spoonful, chewed, took another, said nothing. Margaret decided that was praise enough. The others came in behind him until the table was full of boots, elbows, tin cups, and morning talk. A white-haired ranch hand named Clarence Hobbs broke open one of her biscuits and went still. "These taste like my mother's." Margaret paused beside him. "What was her name?" "Clara." "Then I can't promise they're Clara's." Clarence looked up. "But I can promise I made them with the same intention." He lowered his eyes to the biscuit and nodded once. Caleb had been standing near the coffee pot. Margaret noticed he heard every word. She also noticed he served himself. He never called for her to bring his plate. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch found its rhythm around her. Dell complained less. Clarence began arriving early enough to carry wood. A 19-year-old hand named Jesse lingered after supper one evening, rolling his hat brim between both hands. "Mrs. Dawson?" "Yes?" "You know how to make apple cake?" "I know more than one kind. My grandmother used raisins and molasses. Something else, too. I never knew what." Margaret set down the dish towel. "What did it smell like?" Jesse thought hard. "Cinnamon, maybe cloves, and the raisins were soft." "Anything sharp?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe." Margaret asked 3 more questions. She said nothing about it after that. The next morning, apple cake sat on the breakfast table. Jesse took one bite. His fork stopped. He stared toward the ceiling for a moment before taking another. After that, Margaret's water bucket somehow stayed full. A loose board on the kitchen step got fixed. Firewood began appearing beside the stove before she could ask for it. She never thanked Jesse directly. She simply cut his slice of cake a little larger. Caleb watched those things too. Their conversations remained small. He knocked on the open kitchen door before entering. She began pouring him coffee without asking. He brought flour sacks inside before dawn if he saw them waiting on the porch. He never told her how to run the kitchen. Margaret noticed other things. Caleb worked beside his men when a fence came down. He ate at the same table. When Jesse wrenched his shoulder setting a post, Caleb sat with him in the barn for nearly an hour, talking about horses and weather until the boy's breathing eased and the pain settled. Margaret watched from the kitchen window. She remembered it. By the 5th week, travelers had started hearing about the meals. A cattle buyer stayed for supper. A merchant stopped for water, smelled stew, and stayed for lunch. 2 days later, another rancher appeared. Then another. Caleb came into the kitchen one afternoon holding a small account book. "Travelers are asking what they owe." Margaret stiffened. "And what did you tell them?" "That if they're eating regularly, they can pay." She set down her knife. Caleb continued before she could speak. "The money is yours." Margaret looked at him. "Mine? You're doing the work." He placed the account book on the table. No speech, no favor attached. Just ownership. That evening, Margaret entered the first payment in careful handwriting. For the first time since the bakery closed, the numbers were moving in the right direction. Weeks later, long after supper, she was testing a sourdough meant to keep on cattle drives. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Coyotes called beyond the porch. Neither spoke much. The silence settled easily between them. Margaret found that more unsettling than gossip. She had come to Reed Ranch expecting work. Now Dell saved her a seat at supper. Clarence brought kindling. Jesse repaired things that were not broken badly enough to require repairing. And Caleb Reed had begun to feel like part of the room, even when he said nothing. Margaret pressed both hands into the dough. For the first time, she understood that the ranch no longer felt temporary. The next morning, Caleb entered carrying an envelope. He did not sit. Margaret saw the name in the corner before he spoke. Harold Whitmore. Her hands stopped moving. Caleb looked from the letter to her face. Margaret? She stared at the signature she had not seen in 3 years, then very quietly said, "Open it." Caleb broke the seal. The letter was brief. Harold Whitmore claimed Reed Ranch was operating an unlicensed commercial food business and violating county regulations. He requested that the matter be reviewed immediately. Caleb read it twice. Margaret had already turned back to the work table. Her hands went into the bread dough. Once, twice, too hard. "He's done this before," Caleb said. It was not a question. Margaret kept kneading. "When Thomas died, I opened the bakery on 4th Street because I needed something that belonged to me." Her voice stayed level. "Whitmore sold baked goods out of his dry goods store. Mine were better." Caleb said nothing. "Customers started coming to me, then complaints started." She pressed the dough flat. "Spoiled ingredients, bad storage, sanitation, permits. Every time the inspectors cleared one thing, another complaint appeared." "Was anything proved?" "No." She looked at him then. "That was never the point." Caleb understood. People see enough inspectors going through a door. They stop going through it themselves. Margaret nodded. "By the time everything was cleared, I couldn't make rent. I sold the ovens, paid what I owed, closed the door." The kitchen went still. Caleb folded Whitmore's letter once. "He's not doing it again here." Margaret looked at him. "Men like Harold Whitmore make standing in their way expensive." "I know what Harold Whitmore has." Caleb paused. "I've got more." Margaret almost smiled, but didn't. "Then give me room to fight him too." Caleb held her gaze. "You have it." 3 days later, County Investigator Prescott rode through the Reed Ranch gate carrying a leather satchel and a clipboard. He was narrow in the shoulders and careful in his manner. He inspected the pantry, the stove, the water barrels, the meal ledger. He asked Margaret where flour was stored, how traveler payments were recorded, and whether liquor was served. "No liquor," she said. Prescott wrote anyway. Caleb remained in the doorway the entire time, silent. Prescott glanced toward him more than once. When the investigator finally mounted and rode south, Caleb watched until the horse disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. "The commissioner owes Whitmore favors," he said. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "What are you doing about it?" "I sent a telegram to Aldrich in Cheyenne." She turned. "When?" "The day the letter came." "You should have told me." Caleb went still. Margaret's voice remained quiet, which made the anger sharper. "I've spent 3 years learning what happens when men make decisions around me and call it protection." Caleb did not interrupt. Then he nodded. "You're right about one part. I should have told you before I sent it." Margaret waited. "I'm still paying the lawyer." A short sound escaped her. Not quite laughter. "Of course you are. This is my ranch too, and my work." "I know." That was the end of the argument. Not because Margaret surrendered, because Caleb had heard her. The formal hearing notice arrived the following week. Margaret read every line. Then she started building a file: receipts, ingredient purchases, traveler names, meal payments, dates, letters. By lamplight she wrote until her fingers cramped. When Aldrich arrived from Cheyenne, he sat at the kitchen table turning pages for nearly 20 minutes. Finally he looked up. "Mrs. Dawson, if every client handed me records like these, I'd charge half as much." "You won't," Aldrich smiled. "No, ma'am." Then Whitmore changed tactics. Clara Briggs appeared one afternoon wearing a brown bonnet, and the expression of a woman who had practiced an excuse and abandoned it somewhere between the gate and the kitchen. Margaret poured her coffee. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. "He's talking about you in town." Margaret sat across from her. "What is he saying?" That this isn't really a dining operation. Clara looked uncomfortable. That men come out here for reasons other than meals. Margaret's face did not change. Clara continued carefully. He's saying your relationship with Mr. Reed is improper. For a moment, the only sound was the stove ticking. Margaret looked down at the grain of the table. Business attacks, she understood. This was different. Whitmore was trying to make shame do what paperwork had failed to do. Why are you telling me? Clara lifted her eyes. Because my husband owes that man money. I've watched him lean on decent people for 6 years. She took a breath. And because I ate your bread at the market. Nobody who makes something with that much care deserves to have lies spoken over her. After Clara left, Margaret scrubbed the work table. Once, twice, again. Caleb found her there after dark. What's wrong? She told him. Something changed in his face. He reached for his coat. Margaret stepped between him and the door. Don't fight this with your fists. Caleb looked down at her. I wasn't going to use my fists. That's not the part I'm worried about. His hand fell from the coat. He understood. Whitmore wanted Caleb angry, wanted a powerful rancher throwing weight around so the story could become something else. Margaret shook her head. This one has to be won in daylight. Caleb nodded once. Then daylight it is. The ranch hands noticed. Dell stopped joking when unfamiliar riders passed the gate. Clarence brought twice the firewood she needed. Jesse lingered near the kitchen every evening, as if there were some task he had forgotten. Then one night, after supper, he came back holding a folded sheet of paper. Ma'am, Margaret looked up. Me and the others wrote some things down, in case Aldrich can use them. She unfolded it. 12 names, 12 statements. Dell's was short. Clarence's careful. Jesse's ran nearly half the page. The final line stopped her. I never ate here without feeling like somebody thought I mattered. Margaret read it again. Jesse looked at the floor. Hope that's all right. She pressed her lips together. Tell them thank you. Yes, ma'am. He left. Margaret remained at the table with Whitmore's complaint on one side and the ranch hand's paper on the other. One document said she was a problem. The other said she had made a place feel like home. Caleb came in. He saw the paper, saw her face. He did not ask a question. He simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The morning of the hearing, Margaret placed all 12 statements inside her file. Her prepared speech stayed behind on the kitchen table. Caleb noticed when they were halfway to Red Creek. You forget something. Margaret looked toward the courthouse roof rising beyond the cottonwoods. No. She tightened her hands on the reins. I decided I know what I have to say. By the time they reached Red Creek, the courthouse steps were crowded. That told Margaret everything. Whitmore had wanted an audience. Men stood under the shade of the porch roof. Women gathered near the hitching rails. A few merchants had closed their shops long enough to attend. Inside, boots scraped over plank floors and low voices carried beneath the high ceiling. Harold Whitmore sat near the front, with 2 suited men beside him. He looked comfortable. Margaret sat with Caleb and Aldrich at the opposite table. She placed her file in front of her. Her hands stayed flat on it. Whitmore's attorney spoke first. He talked about licensing, county order, community standards. He chose every word carefully enough that nothing sounded cruel. That was what Margaret remembered most from 3 years earlier. The people who damaged you rarely called it damage. Whitmore stood next. He spoke warmly about honest trade and proper conduct. He mentioned the reputation of Red Creek families. He never raised his voice. Margaret watched him and felt something old inside her go cold. Aldrich rose when Whitmore finished. He did not give the room anything dramatic. He gave them paper, traveler receipts, ingredient purchases, payment records, Margaret's filed permits, Prescott's report showing no sanitary violation, a ledger proving no liquor had been sold. Page by page, the case became smaller. Whitmore's lawyer began writing faster. Then Aldrich sat down. Margaret stood. The room changed. She had no paper in her hands. "I opened my bakery after my husband died," she said. Her voice carried farther than she expected. "I worked before sunrise, paid my bills, kept my kitchen clean. Then complaints started." Whitmore looked at her. Margaret looked back. One complaint became three. Three became inspections. Nothing serious was ever proved. A chair creaked somewhere behind her. "But people saw officials at my door often enough, and eventually they stopped coming through it." She paused. "I lost the bakery anyway." No one moved. Margaret looked toward the commissioner. "I've kept my books here. I've paid what I owe. I've fed people well. The only thing Harold Whitmore cannot tolerate is that this time I succeeded." She let the words settle. "I won't apologize for that." Silence. Then from the back of the room, one pair of hands came together. Slowly. Once. Twice. Margaret turned just enough to see George Pullen, the traveling merchant who had eaten at Reed Ranch weeks before. Another person joined him. Then another. The commissioner struck the desk with his gavel. "Order." The clapping stopped. The meeting did not. Whitmore sat very still. The commissioner called a recess. Margaret stepped into the hallway and drew one long breath. That was when she saw Dell. He stood against the wall in his best shirt. Jesse was beside him. Clarence stood behind them. Then the others. All 12 ranch hands, a workday Thursday. Every one of them cleaned up and dressed as if they were attending church. Dell pushed off the wall. "Figured you might want some company." Margaret looked at them. Jesse gave her a nervous little smile. Clarence held his hat against his chest. For one dangerous second, Margaret could not find her voice. Then she straightened. "Let's go finish it." They went back inside together. The commissioner returned with several papers in hand. He cleared his throat. Having reviewed the documentation, the permits now on file, and the investigator's report, this office finds insufficient grounds to pursue the complaint. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "The matter is dismissed." The room exhaled. Aldrich rose. "Commissioner, I also request that the clerk retain this full record, along with reference to the prior unsubstantiated complaints against Mrs. Dawson's former bakery." The commissioner hesitated, then nodded. "So ordered." For the first time that morning, Whitmore looked uncertain. Another attack would not vanish into rumor now. There would be a record. He stood, buttoned his coat, walked out without looking at Margaret. She watched him go. She felt no triumph, only space. Outside, Jesse began retelling the hearing before they were halfway to the horses. By the time they cleared town, Whitmore's lawyer shutting his notebook had become, according to Jesse, loud enough to scare pigeons off the courthouse roof. Dell looked over. There weren't any pigeons. There could have been. Clarence laughed until he coughed. The men rode behind Margaret and Caleb in a loose line north. After a while, their voices faded into the distance. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "You said you'd been ready 3 years." Margaret nodded. "You meant the bakery." "I did." They rode past a shallow creek, sunlight flashing between the cottonwoods. "For a while," she said, "I thought losing it proved something." "What?" "That maybe Thomas was the only person who ever saw anything worth keeping in me." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, 3 years isn't forever." Margaret waited. "Doesn't make it light." She looked at him. He did not turn toward her. He simply rode beside her. That silence stayed between them all the way home. That night, Margaret served blackberry cobbler. The ranch table was louder than it had ever been. Dell raised his coffee cup toward her from across the room. No speech, just the cup. Margaret nodded. Several quieter weeks followed. Ruth came first, a widow trying to sell preserves. Then Alice, who needed steady work. Then Dora, who had cooked for most of her life and had been told she was too old to be useful. Margaret listened to each of them. An idea began taking shape. Caleb started coming to the kitchen for reasons that had nothing to do with coffee. One evening, he brought a letter. To my sister Eleanor. Margaret looked up. Haven't spoken in 4 years. He read the apology aloud. When he finished, Margaret said, Add one thing you miss, something only she would know. Caleb thought, then wrote one more sentence. 2 weeks later, Eleanor answered. He did not show Margaret the letter. He did not need to. Something in his face had eased. Then one evening, Margaret reached too quickly into the oven. Heat caught 2 fingers. She gasped. Caleb was in the kitchen before she had finished running cold water over them. What happened? I'm fine. He took her hand carefully, not tightly, just enough to turn it toward the lamp. His thumb rested against the unburned skin. Margaret looked down at their hands, then up at him. For a long moment neither moved, and Margaret understood that there was no honest way left to call what had grown between them merely work. Caleb still held her hand beneath the kitchen lamp. The burn was small, a red stripe across 2 fingers. What frightened her had nothing to do with the oven. I came here for wages and a room, she said. Caleb's eyes stayed on hers. I know. I told myself that was all I wanted. He waited. Margaret looked down at their hands. It isn't all anymore. The words sat between them, so Caleb did not smile, did not step closer. He simply considered them with the same care he had given everything important since the day he stopped at her market table. Then he said, I needed a cook when I found you. Margaret's mouth tightened. That is a wonderfully romantic beginning. A faint smile touched his face. Wasn't finished. She waited. I needed a cook, but that wasn't why I stopped at your table. Margaret went still. Caleb looked toward the dark window. I'd seen you standing there before I came over. People kept walking past. Some of them looked straight at you and still kept going. His gaze returned to her. You were tired. I could see that. Margaret swallowed. But you still greeted every person who came near that table like they mattered. He glanced at her bandaged fingers. The cinnamon roll told me you could cook. I knew that after one bite. His voice softened. But that wasn't what made me stop. Margaret did not know what to say. Why didn't you tell me? I hadn't earned the right to tell you what I saw. A small laugh escaped her. Caleb Reed. You are an impossible man. I've been told. He opened the salve tin. Margaret's smile faded. There is something else. Caleb waited. If this becomes more than what it is now, she searched for the right words. I lost Thomas. Then I lost the bakery. For 3 years, I had almost nothing that belonged to me except what I could make with my own hands. Caleb listened. I can't build myself back up just to disappear into another man's life. His expression did not change, but his thumb moved once against her palm. You won't. You can't promise that with a sentence. No. He nodded towards the account book resting beside the flour bin. So we put it in writing. Margaret blinked. Your earnings stay yours. Anything you build from them carries your name. If you want Aldrich to draw it up, he will. She stared at him. And if I need time? Take it. He closed the salve tin, then looked at her with the quiet certainty she had come to trust more than any grand declaration. I'm staying. Margaret felt the words deeper than she expected. Not I will wait forever. Not you owe me. Not choose me. Just that. I'm staying. And he did. For the next several weeks, nothing was withdrawn because she had not answered quickly enough. He still knocked before entering the kitchen, still asked what she thought about ranch decisions, still brought flour in before dawn, still sat with his coffee while she worked and left when she needed quiet. On an ordinary Sunday in late October, Margaret sat at the kitchen table calculating winter flour and coffee. Caleb came in from the yard, washed his hands, and sat across from her. "I've spent 6 weeks trying to say something properly." Margaret looked up. "Any progress?" "Very little," she smiled. He folded his hands on the table. "I want to marry you because I wake up glad you're here." The pencil in Margaret's hand stopped. "Not because the ranch needs you. Not because I think you need saving." He held her gaze. "When I think about the years ahead, you're in them. That's the whole reason." Margaret thought of Thomas. Not with guilt, with gratitude. He had loved her once in a way that taught her love could be kind. She did not believe that kindness would have wanted her buried beside him while she was still breathing. "Yes," she said. Caleb exhaled. Margaret smiled. "Yes, Caleb." At supper, he stood at the head of the table. "Mrs. Dawson has agreed to marry me." Silence lasted 1 beat. Dell leaned back in his chair. "Well, it's about time!" Jessie whooped loud enough to startle Clarence. The room broke open with laughter. They married in December at Red Creek Church. All 12 ranch hands filled the first pews in their best shirts. Eleanor came from Colorado after Caleb's letter repaired what 4 years of pride had damaged. Clara Briggs sat near the back and cried through most of the ceremony. At the ranch reception, Margaret cooked more than anyone thought she should. Caleb found her alone in the kitchen for a moment. "Yeah, you should be out there." "I will be." She pressed both hands to the work table. "I just need 1 minute." Caleb nodded and left her exactly 1 minute. That winter, Ruth came to see Margaret, then Alice, then Dora, women who needed work, women who had been told no often enough to start believing it. By February, Margaret had 3 pages of plans spread across the kitchen table. "A dining house," she said. "Regular meals, a proper kitchen, work for women who need a beginning." Caleb read every page. "You priced lumber." Page 3. He turned the page. A slow smile appeared. "What do you call it?" "Dawson and Reed Dining House." She looked at him. "My name first." "Your name first." Construction began in March. Dell turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone knew. Jessie helped hang the sign. Clarence complained about every board and showed up every morning anyway. Margaret hired Ruth, Alice, Dora, and 18-year-old Faye, who stood in the kitchen doorway on her first day with both hands twisted together. Margaret looked at her and remembered another table, another morning, another woman waiting for someone to stop. "When can you start?" Margaret asked. The dining house opened in May. By noon, every chair was full. In July, Margaret returned to the Frontier Harvest Market. She asked for the same table, the one at the end of the row. Caleb looked at her. "Why that one?" "Because I want to know what it feels like when the ground stays the same and I don't." The morning came hot and bright. Ruth arranged rolls, Alice handled money. Faye moved through the waiting customers taking orders before they reached the table. A line formed before the first hour was over. Margaret stood behind the same weathered boards where she had once earned 30 cents. For a moment she saw the old morning clearly. The empty space, the lowered voices. Bless her heart. Nothing rose in her now, no anger, no need for apology. Caleb appeared beside her. Margaret looked at the line. "They didn't make me," he waited. "And they never unmade me." She turned toward him. "I was always this. I just didn't have anywhere to put it." "I know." "How could you know? You saw me for 5 minutes." Caleb looked toward the place where he had first stopped. "Because everybody else kept walking, then back at her. And you were still standing." Margaret took his hand. right there in the middle of the market. She did not care who saw. Then Faye called from the table. "Mrs. Reed, we're down to one honey cake." Margaret let go of Caleb's hand and turned back to the work. Caleb took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped behind the table beside her. He did not carry her away from the life she had built. He stayed and joined it. And maybe that was the kind of love Margaret had needed all along. Not a man arriving to tell her who she should become. Not a town finally deciding she was worthy. Just someone steady enough to stand beside her while she remembered for herself. If you have ever been passed over, underestimated, or made to feel as though your best days were already behind you, imagine standing where Margaret once stood, at that lonely market table. Imagine wondering if one more disappointment might be the one that finally made you stop trying. Then imagine finding out you were never finished. Sometimes a second chance does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a cup of coffee set beside your hand, in somebody keeping their word, in a table slowly filling with people who are glad you are there. Margaret found love again, but more than that, she found her own place in the world and used it to make room for others. That may be the truest kind of healing. Not forgetting what hurt you, but refusing to let it decide what happens next. If Margaret's journey stayed with you, tell me in the comments what part touched you most. And if you'd like to hear more moving stories of courage, mystery, second chances, and hearts finding their way home, you're always welcome to subscribe and join us for the next one.